Thank you very much. Today, I'm going to talk to you about some work that I've been doing. It actually started, gosh, I'm not really sure when it truly started. I can probably peg it sometime around 2012, 2011, when my postdocs alerted me to this thing called open science, saying, Mike, we really should be making more of our work available. Fast forward about 5 or 6 years, I actually finally got it. And over the last 5 years, one of the things I've been working on intensely within my department, but also in the discipline of psychology, is really trying to push this idea that we need to rethink how we are incentivizing research, measuring research, and evaluating faculty for promotion, tenure, in annual review processes, and so forth. Along the way, I was able to identify some people in my department who had very similar interests. James Grand and Bob Slevick were very keen on sort of, rethinking about how we do what we've been doing for the last, millennia in terms of faculty evaluation. And so the three of us sort of teamed up to put together a paper on, I think the title is something like Aligning Incentives with Institutional Values. Believe it or not. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. I'm also going to talk about some other research I've done on research metrics, and I'm going to end with some examples of how we can move forward with reforms that I think better align what we are as an institution with what we value. Okay, so really thinking about the measurement and the incentive systems within the construct or that concept of value systems. Just a few collaborators here. Some of the work I'm going to present was done with Zach Horn, who's at the University of Edinburgh, and I'm going to lean heavily on some collaborative work, partner in crime, if you will, Aaron McKiernan, who's part of the Open Science Research Funders Group and is at the University of Mexico, the Universidad Nacional Autonomous University in Mexico. Throughout, I'm going to have some citations that I'm going to put in there, mostly just to sort of document things. So if people want to go back and look, they'll know where I'm getting some of the stuff. So fair warning, if you've been steeped in the past and you love the way we've been doing things in the past, you might get a little uncomfortable with what I'm going to talk about today. It's not really, in my mind, a hot button flashpoint type of issue. But, there are people who get, a little worked up when we talk about changing the way we've done things for the last 200 years. So what I'm going to argue for is this values-oriented approach to the way we evaluate research. So what do I mean by that? Well, first of all, we have to think about, what it is that we value as an institution, what we value as researchers, what we value within our disciplines. Okay, so the first step here is identifying what those real values are. The second thing is we have to have some way of letting faculty, students, graduate students, postdocs, other researchers express, not only what they value, but the things that they're going to prioritize in their work. Right? So we don't all do work the same way. We emphasize different aspects of our work. We all have sort of the same portfolio, but we put emphasis in different areas of that portfolio. So we really have to really think about, what we can do to enable faculty to do the things that they do best, rather than forcing everybody to do everything, including the things they don't do well, at the sacrifice of things they do well. Okay. And so one of the aspects of here is allowing faculty to have a little bit of a say, if not a lot of say, in what they value philosophically, but also sort of from a sort of moral perspective as well. And then finally, we have to have some way of documenting what people do. We've all heard of the construct of invisible labor. It is true. In fact, I would say probably 70 to 90% of what we do is invisible. And I say that because what's the primary document that we use to make our work visible? It is the vaunted CV, right? And the CV, the structure of that CV, probably really hasn't changed since the inception of the CV as a construct. It pretty much looks like it's always looked, at least for the last 20, 30 years that I've been in this business. It hasn't changed at all. So we're going to propose some modifications to the traditional curriculum vitae that allows people to emphasize what they do in their work products. A couple of things here for those of you online. You can just type goumd.edu reform if you're interested in learning more about this or being engaged with it. It's just a short questionnaire. Collect your name, your institution, department, and email so that I can sort of start to form a coalition of willing. I have a whole repository available on the Open Science Framework. You're free to go visit it and pull whatever off that you want. And then, of course, if people want to email me, feel free to reach out at any time. I love doing this stuff, and I'm quite passionate about it. Okay, so here are some of the goals of my talk. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to run through some traditional metrics that we tend to use. I'm going to refer to these as reputation-based metrics because, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on whether you benefited from the system, reputation-based metrics are the currency of academia. All right, so we're going to talk about that. And we're going to talk about how they can be problematic, both from a research quality perspective, right? Incentivizing, remember the incentive structures, but also from some of the adverse impacts that they can have on certain groups. I'm going to share some thoughts with you about what I think should matter when evaluating research, and then I'm going to provide some examples at the end where I think, reform is happening. And I think so there's some positive momentum moving forward here. Okay, so first, and this can be an audience participation side, tap it into the chat on Zoom or feel free to speak up. What do universities value? Think about the University of Maryland's mission. What is in that mission statement? Fearlessly features prominently on the front page of that, right? By the way, I really like our new mission statement, our strategic plan. What does that strategic plan emphasize? Places a heavy premium on the public good, right? It talks about how we are here to serve the state of Maryland. We're here to solve problems. We're here to advance science and education and scholarship for the public good for the rest of humanity, right? There's 8 billion people on this earth, and we would be kidding ourselves if we're doing the work purely for ourselves. The academic systems kind of reinforce doing that stuff for ourselves. So if you look into these statements, not just University of Maryland, but you look across mission statements and strategic plans across all sorts of universities, one word that always shows up is excellence. I never really know exactly what excellence is. But the things that do show up are quite telling, right? They say things like, well, our mission is to serve the community, right? They emphasize community. They emphasize public engagement. They emphasize the public good. So what's interesting about these constructs is that when you look at them, first of all, they're in like virtually all mission statements, okay? 87% of institutions have the word community in their RPT, the promotion documents. 75% mention public, 64% mention public engagement and community engagement. So you see this across, high rates of mention across all types of institutions. This graph isn't particularly important for my main point, but just to show that there is a little bit of variance across different institutions. The main point here is these numbers are quite high, right? At R1 institutions, there's a heavy emphasis on publicness, community, helping humanity. Yet, what we know about these is that they typically fall into the service category, right? So when we talk about public engagement or community, these are sort of offloaded to that one category that tends to be undervalued in the way we evaluate faculty, right? If we're going to be brutally honest with ourselves, we're going to say, research is the thing that really matters. Teaching a little bit, service, okay, great. This is where these words tend to show up in RPT documents, is in that service category, right? So they tend to be in the least important of the things in that. So this is just a word cloud that just sort of shows the proximity of these words relative to one another. Things like public are right next to service, okay? Research really doesn't play a fundamental role in the way we think about publicness. Yet, most of our research is really done for the public good, right? This is why we are here, to advance fundamental science, applied science, scholarship to serve the public good. So now if we think about, our tenure and promotion documents, what figures most prominently in this? What sort of terms come to mind? Things like quality, impact, right? Excellence, production. So we typically see words like impact or, emphasis on traditional scholarly outputs or metrics, right? The word metrics, like we're going to look at all these metrics, and from those metrics, we'll know, who's doing good research and who's not, right? Those metrics are implied to capture things like quality, right? So I'm going to challenge some of those things here in a little bit. But, so where do these things show up? Well, impact is high on the list of things that are in RPT documents. I'm using RPT here for promotion and tenure documents. Metrics, also high on the list, particularly within R-type institutions, traditional outputs. We just want to see those peer-reviewed publications, book chapters, those sorts of things. The world has changed. We don't have to focus on a singular way of putting our scholarship out there. The other thing you see a little bit of here is open access. But what's curious about this is the term open access is oftentimes associated with negative terms, right? Like, what is it? The predatory journals, right? So there's this implicit association that, well, it's open access. That must be bad, right? It's not a good quality journal if it's an open access journal. Predatory journals do exist, but, a good number of places where people are publishing open access work are in reputable journals, right? They're going through the peer review process. By the way, I have a little problem with peer review too, but that's a different talk. Okay, so citation metrics and journal impact factors are what I would call, excuse me, reputation-based metrics. We use these as proxies, right? So we think, okay, well, they published in the right journal, or people have cited that work, right? So we take the correct journal or the best journals to represent sort of the quality of one's work, right? But these are, if we're going to be very charitable about it, remote proxies of the underlying scholarship. And there's a lot of reasons why we might want to question the use of those. One is, right, people cite things for a whole bunch of different reasons, including negative citations. Here's another fun one for you. Turns out that about 46% of authors, not my work, by the way, report not reading the work that they cite. Okay, so let's think about the word impact here, right? If I'm using citations as a measure of impact, and yet the people who are doing those citations haven't read the work, how in the heck could it have been impactful on the way they're thinking? Right? Okay. So I think needless to say, there's a disconnect between the way we think about impact and the way citations are being used as an index of impact and what they really capture. There's also a lot of evidence that suggests that, citations frequently are done for like perfunctory reasons, right? Think about your own writing. You might select who to cite based on how well known they are, right? Right, the reputation of the person. Well, whoever has the most citations, right? The names that come to mind. Well, what are the names that come to mind? The first names that come to mind in your field are probably the most well-known people, right? So they're going to benefit from their already well-knownness. And whether or not it's the most appropriate work to cite, it's going to get cited in lieu of maybe a more appropriate piece of scholarship that's coming from a young scholar or from someone who's a little less known, right? We all fall prey to this. It's hard to get around. It's a fundamental cognitive principle that what comes to mind is the thing that we're going to go with, right? Think about the mere exposure effect or the validity, the truth validity effect. We tend to believe things. We tend to put more faith in things that we are familiar with. Well, we also tend to probably cite things that we tend to be more familiar with. Okay. All right. So we think about journal impact factors as a sort of index of quality, or citation counts as reflecting something about quality or reusability or something. Well, the problem with these is that they are metrics. And anytime you have a metric, that is an indicator of a system, people will figure out a way to game that system by gaming that metric. All right. So as soon as something becomes something that is to be maximized, people will figure out ways to maximize that, irrespective of what we think they should be doing with those things, right? This is known as Dougherty's law. So faculty are graduate students, postdocs, staff. We're smart people, right? We live in this educational institution, and we learn how to adapt to this institution, and we will fall prey to these sort of gamings, whether we want to or not, right? It doesn't have to be intentional, but we're going to sort of fall into this. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit more about this moving forward. All right, if you don't believe me, all you got to do is Google how to game citations, and you'll get tons and tons of advice, even in reputable journals. So Nature has even published some of these how to game your citation indices, right? So it's not just, people are out there gaming. It's literally, if you want to advance your career, do these things. 5 things, 10 things, 20 things, right? You can probably find an article that says 30 ways to game your citations, right? It's actually fairly easy to do. One of the best ways to do it is to cite other people that you want to cite you, right? Because guess what other people read? They read the things that other people are including their citations in. So there's a lot of different ways in which we can go about gaming our citations. And I think this advice, coupled with the fact that we just know it happens, should call into question the use of these metrics as a valid indicator of research quality. But let's just not accept that as evidence. Let's move on to some data. All right. So the question here that we might ask ourselves is, do citations belong on the right-hand side of the equation, right? Is that what we're trying to predict? So faculty success as measured by citations? Or is it that we want to think about citations as a reflection of something else, right? The right-hand side of the equation. It's the difference between whether it's the thing that we want to maximize or if it's a thing that's an indicator. And I would argue that for too long, and somewhere in that process, citations have migrated from being an indicator to being the thing that's maximized, right? That's the currency of the academic system. We want to maximize our currency. We want to maximize our citations. Okay, so now let's get into some data. So I'm going to address these 2 very broad questions. The first one is, do citation counts or journal impact factors really capture key aspects of research quality, impact, and success? Just kind of back up a little bit here. In my own reading of this literature, oftentimes I find that the term quality ends up being tautological, that we use the same thing to define quality as we use to measure it, right? So citation counts reflect quality in as much as quality is reflected in citation counts. So it's very tautological the way these terms are bandied about. We just assume, right, that they reflect something and then we move forward. The second question I'm going to ask here is, if citation counts aren't a reflection of quality, then what do they reflect? The data I'm going to present will be from my own work. It'll be on that first question, along with some other stuff. And then on the second question, I'll be pulling in data from other sources. One of is just a summary table of 20 or 30 papers, and I didn't actually include the citations, so I apologize for that. Okay, so this first broad question, do citation counts and journal impact factors capture key aspects of research quality, impact, or success? So this begs the question, right? How are we going to define quality if not by citation and impact factors? So here's just a couple of ways we might think about doing this, right? Arguably, we might think about research design characteristics like random assignment, the use of proper control groups, the use of blind or double-blind procedures, the use of the proper use of statistics, subjective assessments. That's actually a fairly common one in this literature. Or we can look at things like the presence or absence of statistical reporting errors, the strength of the data as represented in the papers that are being published, and the degree to which the things that are being published are replicable or not replicable, okay? I have the last 3 bolded for a reason, because those are the things I'm going to focus on. And I'll get to the reason why I'm not going to focus on these. Well, basically, I want to look at this at a big scale, not just a handful of papers that I can hand code for these properties. I want to look at it across a population of articles, some close to population of articles. Subjective estimates tend not to be reliable. If you don't believe me, just take the word of some people who study these things. Turns out that the inter-rater reliability amongst peer reviewers is, guess what it is? Kappa coefficient ranging from 0 to 1. Anybody want to guess? 0.3? That is really, who said that? Okay, you're covering your mouth, so I couldn't tell. That's a really good guess, but it's a little lower than that. If I'm doing research and I have multiple raters, I typically look for something at least, 0.6 is still kind of sketchy. 0.7 or better, right? That the meta-analytic estimate of inter-rater reliability is somewhere around 0.18. And that was some, I think, Bjornsman or somebody like that who did this research. There's also some other evidence that suggests that maybe peer review isn't so good. And that's when people are asked specifically to look at the quality before publication, right? Subjective assessments probably aren't that reliable. Anyway, I'm going to focus on these last three because I can do it on a large scale. So we took this is my work with Zachary Horn. We took a big data approach to this. So we got our hands on a data set of 45,144 articles. This work was part of the, what was it called? Statistical checking for errors. I'm blanking on the name of the package that is used for this. But essentially what they did is they combed through 50,000 articles looking for occurrences of statistical reporting errors to look at the prevalence with which different types of errors might be represented in those journals. They made that data public. Okay, so an example of how publicly available data can now benefit someone else. I took that data and then I merged it with some other things. In particular, I pulled in the citation counts for all of those articles and merged it with the 2017 impact factors. All right, so all the citation counts and the 2017 impact factors. And then what we did was we ran a series of multi-level models to look at the degree to which things like impact factors and citation counts predict key aspects of quality. In this case, we're going to be looking at statistical reporting errors, okay? And then I'm going to show you some other stuff here in a little bit. This particular model used a multi-level zero inflated Poisson model. And all these models are available on an OSF webpage. So here's a snapshot of these results, okay? First of all, remarkably flat lines, right? There doesn't seem to be a whole lot of action going on here. The little action that is taking place is with impact factor. It would appear as though really low impact factor journals have a slightly higher incidence of errors that are reported in those journals compared to higher impact factors. Exploring this a little bit more, turns out that if I only look at journals with an impact factor of 2 or higher, that line is completely flat. All right, so the effect is entirely dependent on this small number of journals with impact factors between 0 and 2. All right, everything else is more or less flat. There appears to be some improvement of error rates as a function of year, so some decrease in the number of errors from the early 80s through 2000. I think this data set ended in 2016, 2018, something I can't remember, and so forth. So not a lot of action here in terms of the number of errors. One thing that we do see, if we do different ways of slicing the data, if we ignore the multi-level structure, it turns out that I think it's the papers with higher citation counts have slightly more errors than papers with, but that's ignoring the multi-level structure. Okay, so let's go on to the next one. All right. So the next question we asked and answered, do highly cited papers or papers in high impact factor journals report stronger statistical evidence to support their claims? So for this, what we did is we converted the statistical test to a degree of evidential value. So we took all the 1 degree freedom F tests, the T tests, and the Pearson's R, converted those into a Bayes factor. The Bayes factor is an index of the degree to which the data are supportive of the alternative hypothesis versus the null hypothesis. There are some downsides to this approach, by the way, as with the error approach, is that we aren't looking at focal hypotheses per se. We're looking at all the statistical tests reported across all the articles. And so we don't have granular detail about which specific hypothesis was tested by each one of these individual hypothesis tests. But on average, what we can do is think about the degree to which the authors of a paper are, the degree to which the data that the authors are providing in support of a hypothesis actually supports that hypothesis, okay? We modeled this one with a multi-level beta regression, Bayesian multi-level beta regression, using citation, impact factor, number of authors, degrees of freedom of the tests, and year of publication, as well as area within psychology as part of that multi-level structure, predicting the Bayes factor. Here we converted the Bayes factor into a probability between 0 and 1 so that we could do the beta regression. And here's what we find. Again, remarkably flat lines. So the charitable way of thinking about this is that there's no relationship between any of these metrics and the degree of the strength of the evidence that's being proffered by authors. Up in the left-hand corner, we do find a reliable negative relationship between citations and the degree of strength. So again, take this with a grain of salt. It doesn't account for that much variance, but if anything, there's a negative relationship. Same thing with impact factors. Higher impact factor journals are publishing more believable stuff. This is what the Bayes factor captures, the degree to which the data support a hypothesis. We should be updating our beliefs based on that degree. And higher impact factor journals are falling flat on that. And I have some converging evidence on this too. There's other ways of looking at strength of evidence or replicability. I'll show some replicability stuff soon. And it all sort of converges on the same answer. This one kind of surprised us, number of authors, that the more authors you have on a paper, the less strength the data, the less strength in favor of your hypothesis is being presented. Okay, so more authors leads to less evidence. This might be too many cooks in the kitchen, right? Too many people working with data, finding weak relationships where maybe they shouldn't even be going there, right? That's just quite honestly a hypothesis, not there's no evidence to suggest anything. Okay, so the next question we addressed is, well, I should be transparent about this because I'm big into transparency. This data set is the same as this data set, okay? Just to make sure that you're all aware that they aren't independent data sets. They actually are the same data set. This data set is different though, okay? So here what I did was I collated 190 replication attempts within the behavioral sciences, mostly within psychology, and looked at whether or not we could model or predict those replication successes as a function of a set of variables, impact factor, citations, number of authors, et cetera. Okay, many of you know, psychology's dirty laundry has been hanging out for a while. We aren't the only ones, but ours has been out there swinging in the wind for everybody to see. But we're also taking some action. So there has been a lot of change in psychology over the last 10 years that have been, I think, positive forces for our field. There's still more work to do, but there's been some positive advancements here. But that all being said, we can now look at what is it that predicts replication success. Again, we fit a Bayesian multi-level logistic regression on this to predict what's going to replicate and what's not. And here are the results. Smaller sample size, okay, so keep that in mind. No relationship with citation counts in terms of replication success. Although you can look at that and think, oh, maybe some positive trends. There is a negative relationship, though, with impact factor. So a reasonably strong, although there's a lot of uncertainty in these curves, relationship between where something is published in terms of impact factor and future replication success. The really high impact factor journals aren't doing that well. Now, there's some issues with this too, okay? Again, just to be transparent, not everything gets replicated. These aren't random samples of studies that have been pulled and replicated. They've been selected, maybe because people had questions about them, right? There could be a lot of reasons that these things have been pulled out. So they aren't a random sample of what's out there in the ecosystem. But what we do know based on this is that minimally, these high impact factor journals are not publishing better science necessarily, right? We aren't the only ones to show this pattern. There's been other people who have shown these patterns. No relationship with number of authors on this one. This is just, again, full transparency. If you look at the R squares, these are Bayesian estimated R square values, not a lot of variance being accounted for by these factors, right? So there's really not much there in the data in terms of substantiveness. But once you think about this in the context of a very large ecosystem of research, one has to start worrying about, well, wait a minute, at the population level, a small amount of variance could lead us in really bad directions, right? How many people have invested a lot of time and energy into doing a study predicated on something else, only to find out 10 or 15 years later that the original one did not replicate or could not replicate or had some other serious methodological problems, right? So the point here isn't so much about some of these replication problems. It's really about what we're incentivizing, right? Are we incentivizing people in a way so that they can do their best research, or are we incentivizing people in a way so that they can get the most attention, right? And I think we all want it to be about the research, right? We want people to do good research. We want to solve humanity's problems. The incentive structures are in some ways in the way, right? They're preventing us from really doing that, because if I want to get tenure, me addressing that really important problem might have to wait because I need to pump out a bunch of publications that are easier to pump out, right? Or maybe I need to take some shortcuts. There's some great work on gaming the system by, what's his name? McElreath and Smaldino. If you haven't seen the paper, it's a great read. All right, so again, not just me, other people have observed some of these relationships as well. A paper that came out in, I think, 2014 by Dina Sukes and Ioannis, I think I have his name. I'm pretty sure I don't have that right. Negative relationship between impact factor and statistical power. Just, looking at the statistical power of the statistical test, fairly strong negative relationship. Chris Fraley and Samin Vazir found a negative 0.48 correlation between impact factors and statistical power. They called NPAC. It's actually sample size. So they're using sample size as a proxy for that. And then here's one of my favorite papers showing that novelty, we're incentivized. We got to do novel work that no one else has done. Well, guess what? Turns out that the high impact factor journals don't publish more novel work, even though that's what they're all about, right? It must be novel to be published in Nature or Science or the proceedings of national academies. Yet, if you look objectively at sort of one way of measuring novelty, it's not showing up, right? There's this negative relationship between impact factor and the novelty of the work. By the way, they define novelty computationally using like latent semantic analysis of the citation patterns to see who was actually bridging different literatures in their work. Okay, so if only based on metrics of quality, I would say, wait a minute, maybe we should be rethinking our use of these impact factor things and these citation indices, right? But there's more, okay? And this is where I think it gets really, really problematic. And that is these traditional metrics are also systematically biased against women and other diverse groups. So this is a paper that came out just about a year ago, actually less than a year ago. This one is in the Proceedings of National Academies, where they showed these sort of intersectionality differences. Here are all the plots of the women. Here are all the plots of the men. This is the average citation for men and women as a function of topics scored by average citations. So in essence, what they're showing is that, the incentive structures are set up in a way to favor men, right? And not just men, white men. It's, a fairly complicated picture here, but you can see clear variance amongst different groups and between males and females. And it's not just, this one paper. This finding has been around since the 90s. In the communications literature, they found this previously, and recently it's been replicated or shown across physics, communications, another paper, economics, social sciences, and medicine. I mean, I'm not a lawyer, but I would say, anytime we start using metrics that show systematic bias against a particular group, it becomes legally problematic. All right. So again, that's something for the university lawyers to suss out. But I think from a moral perspective, this is something we just, if we're aware of it, we should probably do something to address it. All right, we are live again. Okay, so we want to set this system up so that when people game it, they're engaging in pro-social behaviors. And the important thing here is that these promotion and tenure policies codify what those incentive systems are. So what might we want our faculty to engage? We might want them to engage inclusiveness. We might want them to game reproducibility, right? Producing high quality reproducible science. We might want them to gain societal benefit. What are they doing to benefit the society, or engagement with the community? Or how about accessibility? And that's a big one for you, right? How can you make your work, your tools, your interfaces, how can you make those maximally accessible? And there's probably a lot of lessons that the rest of the community can learn from the work that's done here at HCIL in terms of this accessibility part. How can we improve that accessibility to diverse communities and to the scientific communities? And how can we use that all to accelerate science through better sharing and communication? This is just a graphic. I would say we're here to serve humanity, but if you really look at what we do, most of the research is done in well-resourced westernized institutions, right? That means primarily in the US, primarily in Western Europe, and a few other countries. Yet, if you dig down into that, only about 30% of that work is made publicly available throughout the world through open access publishing options or whatever. On the other hand, our neighbors to the south make about 70% of their work, or maybe even more, 90% of their work available publicly to the world. The culture of open sharing is much stronger in the global south than it is in the global north. Yet, we are responsible for producing the majority of the science. So we have to ask, who has access to this stuff. And it's not just articles. I would argue data are really critical here. And what I see as severely problematic is this graph up here on data sharing behavior. So this was a paper that just came out a few months ago, I think in Nature, a paywall journal, so bear that in mind, where they looked at almost 1,800 manuscripts. And after they've gone through a round of asking people for their data, 1,800 manuscripts where they said the data would be available upon request. Of those, 120 of them provided the data in a usable format. That is sad, okay? And unacceptable as a scientific discipline, right? Again, we're here to serve the benefit of society. And if we aren't doing that, then we have some problems. Here's some personal stories. I'm not going to go through these, but if you go to OA Works under the testimonials, you'll see some really interesting stories where people, life or death decisions, like they're dealing with something in themselves, a child or a family member, and they can't access the information to make an informed decision. Why? Because it's locked behind a paywall, right? And it's not just, again, I don't want to focus entirely on the paywall, because it's not just about paywalls, because we have to think about engaging other people in the production of science, not just in the consumption of science. And we can do that through better making available our research, our data, our code, our tools, and et cetera. And so here's the construct that I'm trying to push, and that is impact as access. So let's think about impact in a fundamentally different way. Let's think about it in terms of what have we done to grant other people access. So we're talking about potential for impact, right? Real impact could take decades, maybe never even happen, right? We never know when we do a project whether it's going to do the thing that we really hoped it was going to do. But at least we can think about potential for impact. Nothing has potential if it's not accessible. It only has potential if it's accessible. So we can ask, who has access to our research? What do people have access to? How can we broaden that access? And how might broadening that access benefit society? Where are we at on time? I don't have. Okay, all right. Doing better than I thought. So there's growing momentum towards reform. And this is where I wanted to get to share things that are happening here at Maryland, but also nationally and internationally. Okay. So you all know about the OSTP guidance that dropped here recently about federally funded work. So moving forward, if you have federal money, you're going to be asked, share your work, share your data, share your tools, share your papers. We've done some things in our department to reimagine the way we're doing all of our incentive structures, and I'll share a little bit more information on that. And then there's the Helios program. This is just one of many things that are going on. I just want to call your attention, though, to the memorandum from OSTP, because in the subject line, it literally says ensuring free, immediate, and equitable access to all federally funded work. Why are they doing this? Because they recognize that public dollars should benefit the public. We're a public institution. Taxpayers pay for our salaries. They fund the institution, yet your neighbors won't have access to the work we do here, right? And when you retire, well, actually, if you retire, you'll still have access. But when you graduate, you won't have access. Okay, so progress and success stories. There's an unprecedented desire right now, I think, to change the system. And it's not just tweaking, right? It really is an all-out frontal assault on solving this problem. Some people say it's a hard problem to solve. It's like impossible. It's really challenging. And I say, this is my response, climate change is hard. Doing the right thing is not hard, okay? It's easy to choose to do the right thing. Well, most of us, anyway. So that should not be a problem. But you look across this, right? There are things happening in the US government, in the European Union, internationally, groups like UNESCO, the World Health Organization, Plan S, the United Nations, are all deeply concerned about equitable access to knowledge and knowledge production. In fact, I think it was just about 3 weeks ago that the United Nations held their third Open Science, Open Scholarship Conference. Helios was launched about, I want to say maybe a year and a half ago. It is a collection of 90 universities across the US, all dedicated, in principle anyway, to solving the open scholarship issue. And there's a lot of other things happening at learned societies, at the level of philanthropic organizations and private funders, the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, Bill Gates Foundation. They're all sort of on board with these things. And in fact, in some ways, the philanthropists are leading the charge. Here at Maryland, I mentioned this earlier, but our libraries has taken a leading role in this. And interesting sort of fact is that libraries everywhere have been on board with open scholarship, probably since the invent of scholarship, right? Because that's their mission. Libraries' roles are much broader than that, of course. And so the libraries here at Maryland and elsewhere are really sort of pushing this initiative. We have a group here at the University of Maryland, about 7 or 8, maybe up to 10 or so of us who are trying to do some stuff locally on campus. Again, if you're interested in reform, or if you want to be involved, go to that link at the bottom, send me your information. I'll be happy to reach out. And then I mentioned the 90 institutions, College Park, Baltimore County, Eastern Shore, Towson, are all part of Helios. I just want to give you one little quick example, because where are we at, Joel? 8 minutes. All right. In 2017, we went through a full-on reform of everything in our department. And I will say that the most time-consuming part of this was educating faculty, right? To bring them up to speed on what's happening in our discipline. And it took a lot of time to get people to think, okay, wait a minute, we don't have to be doing the same thing that we've been doing forever. We could do things differently. All right, so we've changed most of our systems. I'm not going to, I'll skip over that. But essentially what we did was we interweaved values from everywhere in the hiring and recruiting aspect of our job advertisements, all the way through some new faculty awards that are coming out. And I'm going to skip over a whole bunch of this stuff. But here I'll just say that you think it's impossible. It's actually fairly easy to do, because people are, I think, interested in it, and they certainly become interested in it when they learn about the problems with the way we've been doing it. And people are grateful. So I had faculty actually come up to me and thank me for leading this through. And it was, this is just not about purely about openness and transparency. It's a big piece of it, but it really is framed from this perspective of, how can we better serve the people that we want to serve, not just in research, but also in teaching. So I had rolled out some internal funding initiatives to support open education. So we're doing some great stuff there. And I mentioned early on, you can't reward research you can't see, right? Or activities you can't see. And so one thing that we've transitioned to is moving away from the standard format of how we document our scholarship to now annotating those research scholarship pieces across a set of dimensions. All right. So we've adopted this. The University of Oregon has also adopted this in their psych department. And so now on our CVs, when people go through the tenure process, what they will be reporting is information that tells them much more about that thing in the article. I think that's useful, right? Right? I could publish 10 things with one study each, or I could say, you know what? I'm going to group together these 5 studies into a single paper. But if I group them together, wait a minute, I only get one publication out of it, and that's all that counts is numbers. Well, it shouldn't be about the number of publications, about the work that goes into it and the work product. And so one thing we're trying to do is really sort of move towards focusing less on numbers and more on substance. And one way we're doing that is by trying to capture these annotations. I won't go through all these other things. The slides will be shared freely, but thank you. Appreciate your attention and patience.